Everybody see this book? This book is called Christian Worship. It's Theology and Practice. You don't have to get this book, by the way. This is just an example. Just notice it's got a bunch of stuff highlighted. What I wish I had kept that I didn't keep was my little card index. So when I started at Tribeca as a freshman, I did mention earlier for those who heard that I clept a few classes, like a semester's worth of classes, and my name begins with L, right? So I'm right in the middle of the alphabet, which means as a freshman, you register last, right? Everybody that's been on campus, the sophomores and the juniors, they all registered for classes before the start of semester, and then you show up 3 days before school starts. 3 days before classes start, and you register as a freshman for your classes. And they run you through the mill in the gym, or at that time at the gym at Tribeca, and you sign up for all those classes you need. Well, you know what happens is all of those general ed classes that I didn't clep out of filled up before I could get them, with one exception. I did take world civilization, world history 1 and 2, and that had not filled up. So that was like the one general ed class that I got to take. My first freshman semester was the civilization, the history of the Western world, whatever, the Western Civilization 1. And I don't know, maybe because I was friends with the chairman of the religion department, and I was a declared religion major, he signed a waiver that allowed me to take junior level theology classes as a first semester freshman, which included this class, this like senior level theology class called Theology of Worship and Music, which you were supposed to take if you were going to take it after you had already had Systematic Theology 1 and 2, your junior year. So I jumped into this world with both feet into a raging river that was deeper than I could stand in, okay? Sure. And so what did I do is I took my book and a highlighter, and if I had any question or thought that it might be important to remember, I highlighted it. That way I could go back and read it again and again and again. And every time I came across a word that I was not sure how it was being used or what it meant, some of them were just absolutely brand new to me. And some of them I thought, I've never seen this word used this way before. And I would write them down on a little 3x5 note card and stick them in a file in alphabetical order. And then I would go to a dictionary and look them up. And if they didn't make sense from there, I would go to a theological dictionary, which I bought. Wasn't required, but I bought it because they had one in the bookstore, and I thought I'm going to need that. And then I would figure out which of those definitions, the Webster's definition or the theological dictionary definition, I needed to use in that context. And I went through several packs of 3x5 note cards. I mean, hundreds of them in this class. I say that, Steve, because yes, grace, faith, and holiness may feel that way. And all of you, I'm just going to say, don't let it put you off. Please don't let it put you off. Let it inspire you to learn more. Like, there is a whole world out there, and you might not know about it. And your entry into that world might be the definition of a word in a context you've never seen or used before. And vocabulary ends up being really important. This is sort of my appeal to you on this. Some of these Grace, Faith, and Holiness book. I know tree is just a 4-letter word, right? And you could sort of say you can just learn tree, right? But you can also learn trunk and roots and branches and leaves. And you can learn phloem and xylem. And you can learn things like medullary rays. And you can learn words like photosynthesis, right? And when you've learned all of that vocabulary, you know a lot more about the tree than when you just called it a tree. So that's my little speech on hang in there with grace, faith, and holiness. If you don't know what prolegomena is, it's okay. You'll find it in the dictionary. The things that go before, the words that go before, it's, you know, it's a setup, right? It's a preface. It's a big fancy word for, you know, the author's introduction to what they're doing. And just hang in there. Some of those ologies, soteriology, I mean, whenever he uses those words, epistemology, go look them up. If you don't know what they mean, if you're not familiar with them, if you're not sure of the context, look them up. You will be the better for it. You just will be. Okay. I think I've made an appeal for, as we study theology, never to lose touch with the practical world. If we're ever running around in the heady world of talking about theological topics, there really is always a practical touch point. And if I don't make one of those, make me make one of those, okay? I'll try to make those, but if I don't make one of those, make me make one of them. Just, you know, hop in and say, now, what has that really got to do with the price of rice in China or something like that? You know, just, how am I ever going to use that in the pulpit? Why is that ever going to matter in ministry? And we'll do our best to make those connections. So we have talked about what is theology, the study of God, the study of how we understand God, all of those things. What is systematic theology? Well, systematic theology probably should be distinguished from biblical theology this way. Systematic theology uses both the language and the organizational principles as well as a lot of the vocabulary of formal philosophical inquiry. Where biblical theology seeks to organize our understanding or our study of God around the themes and narratives that arise in our study of the text of Scripture. So if we're going to do biblical theology, tracing the story of God through the Bible, we're going to do biblical theology, we're probably going to talk about creation theology. We're probably going to talk about the theme of exile. We're probably going to talk about covenants and covenant theology. We're going to talk about law, and in particular, the Pentateuch and God's law. We're going to talk about Torah, both as law, a code of law, as well as its understanding as a way of life. We're going to talk about the prophetic voice. We're going to talk about themes that we find in the prophets. We're going to talk about wisdom literature. I hope that it's becoming obvious. We're going to organize our thinking about God according to those themes and topics we find in Scripture. It's going to be biblical theology. Well, what are we going to do when we do systematic theology? Well, maybe a clue is we're going to be systematic. We're going to use a system or systems. There's more than one that are employed. Some have chosen to start with the doctrine of God and work with some controlling set of principles down. Some use other organizing principles, but we are Wesleyans. And as Wesleyans, we are never going to allow ourselves to become divorced from Scripture. This is going to become very evident when we talk about the Wesleyan quadrilateral. One of the lines when you draw the Wesleyan quadrilateral will be a line for Scripture. And if you ever draw a quadrilateral for me, that's the Wesleyan quadrilateral, the line that's labeled Scripture ought to be the longest line. I don't care whether you put it on the top or the bottom. You can explain that how you want to, but it needs to be the biggest one, because the point is the Bible is always our main source, our only source for doctrine and doctrinal truth. And we may bring reason and tradition and even experience, or Wesley's word would have been experimental, understandings in as well. But if we don't find it in Scripture, we're not going to use it as a doctrine. Okay? We may use all sorts of tools. So even though we're going to be doing systematic theology, we're going to be studying theology, and we're going to be trying to use a more philosophical, more logical, deductive kind of approach, we're going to stay grounded in Scripture. We're not going to let logic lead us somewhere that Scripture doesn't allow us to go. This is where I take my cheap shot on Calvin. Just because Calvin ought to have cheap shots taken at him. That's what he gets for throwing all those Catholics in the bog. But that's that's your history class, not your theology class. But there was theology behind that anyway. Calvin, I think, writes some of the best biblical commentaries you can get your hands on. They have held up well. Calvin's insights into the text of Scripture are solid. They do not square well with his institutes, which is his systematic theology. As a matter of fact, I think if you study them both carefully, you can find places where Calvin's observations and notes on Scripture would all but directly contradict his formal theological assertions in the Institutes. Scratch your head and go, how can that be? Well, that can be when you view studying Scripture as one discipline, kind of put it over here on the side, and when you do formal theology, you begin with a premise that says God is sovereign. The controlling doctrine in Calvinist theology, by the way, God is sovereign. In case you've never been to a Baptist church and listened to a Baptist minister preach about the sovereignty of God, they do it really well. Not that Baptists are necessarily Calvin, but they think they are. Sorry, that's another quib we can talk about sometime. But if you come over here in your institutes, which Calvin does, and he begins with this great doctrine, God is sovereign, and then he allows logic to be the controlling deductive force without having scriptural correction to his logical deductions, then you end up with God makes every decision in the universe. He's sovereign. He's in control of everything. That's logical, right? It is logical. But Scripture seems to tell us a much more messy story about God's interaction with human beings. When we do systematic theology, yes, we're going to use logic, we're going to use reason, faculty, we're going to use various forms of deductive work, logical extensions, but we're going to be controlled by the revelation we have in Scripture. We're going to be corrected by the revelation we have in Scripture. Moving on in what you would know and see as